the unfortunate position of being 1 minute before lunch break, so hopefully you'll give me slightly more than 1 minute, but not too much more. As Michela said, I was thinking I would bring you the scoreboard and dashboard we developed at the European Systemic Risk Board, but then I thought you've had enough for this morning of these things, and I would rather give you some thoughts of what it was like to produce one of these things and now what it's like to be using them from a policy perspective. So I've been on both sides, and it gives, if you want, different perspectives. So I would say that the first issue we had to tackle when we were designing the scoreboard / dashboard was whether we wanted this to be an input into decision making or the output of decision making. Now this sounds like not such an important thing, but in fact this really drives the whole exercise, because if you wanted this to be an input, then it's really a starting point, it's a kind of an aggregator of information, and you go about it in a certain ways, while if it's an output, it's really more about communicating decisions made. So the role of expert judgment is entirely different, because the decisions, you don't expect your decisions to be entirely driven by your input data. And so if you want these tools, you really have to figure from the beginning whether you just want them to display information in an efficient way, and so it's all about visualizing information and bringing together disparate data, which is a statistical exercise, or whether you want to communicate effectively in a sort of evidence-based way how you decided, but of course it is clear that your decision is relying on lots of qualitative input that comes from discussions and so on. And so then that leads to a completely different way of visualizing your results. I would argue that in the first case, you're okay with something that has lots of granular information, and in the second case, you want your customers to get a bird's eye view of someone said before, 7 plus or minus 2 inputs. That's more than enough to explain based on what you made your decisions, but it's probably not enough if you want to make a complex decision which needs lots of input. And this is why we decided this to be an input, and we had more than 60 indicators. And so this just tells you, now whether we look at all of them, this I won't say, because but at any given moment we look at some of them. So I would say this is the first divide. A second issue which comes up when you do these things is that you have a tension between you want to compose, and as soon as you have composed your information in a composite indicator, then you want to decompose. And you're constantly composing and decomposing your indicators. But this is just the way it should be, so we shouldn't be worried. It is a bit bothersome for the people who do the composition part, because then the others, they decompose all the time. And then you feel, why did I spend so much time composing when all you want is the little bits and pieces? But in fact, there is nothing wrong in that, I would say. So I would like to share some good words on that. So, for example, let's take the simplest indicator that everybody looks at in economics, which is government debt or GDP. So this is a very simple one. It is a composite indicator because it is made of 2 pieces. Now you plot Japan versus Greece. You see that both of them are high, both of them are growing. And if I told you that, you would say that Japan and Greece public finances are in similar situations. Now, as we all know, they're not. And why are they not, though? Because both are high and both are growing. And so the composite indicator is telling you something, but then what you do, you decompose. So you say, well, first of all, you look at the composite and you say the level in Japan is a lot higher than in Greece. So they should be in much more trouble than Greece. In fact, they're not. Then you wonder, why are they growing? So in Japan, the numerator is growing, debt is growing rather than GDP decreasing, while in Greece, it's GDP that's decreasing. So there's the first level of decomposition, if you want, is you take the numerator and denominator and you look at them, and that's something I tend to do all the time. Every time I have a ratio, I ask people to give me to plot me the 2 things. So again, they wonder, why did you ask for a ratio when then you want to see the 2 things? Yes, well, that's the unfortunate reality of things. And then yesterday I learned, speaking with our Japan expert, that so I said, okay, so in Japan, government is spending a lot. Why is the economy going nowhere if they're spending so much? The government debt is increasing so much. GDP is flat. What is it that I'm not understanding here? They're spending and doing all these things and nothing's happening. And he said, well, it's a myth. They're not spending more. It's just they're having less tax receipts. So what's happening, the debt is increasing because spending is increasing a little bit, but receipts have been decreasing a lot because, for example, they get less taxes on real estate and stuff like that. And so that might explain why GDP is not moving. So the second level of decomposition is you get into your variable and you start decomposing your variable. So debt now has become expenditures minus receipts. And that's another thing. And then I go back to, so why is Japan and Greece going the same way, but we think of them so differently? And then, of course, we know it's because the Japanese debt is held by Japanese savers, so it's all a domestic redistribution, while Greek debt is held by foreigners mostly, so the issue is completely different. So then we're bringing in a variable from outside, which is, it's not in our indicator, but it's more information. And so this is the life of a composite indicator. You compose it, then you decompose it, then you decompose the single variables, then you bring in more information because you didn't have enough of it. And then you wonder, okay, why did I have a composite indicator at the beginning? But you actually needed it because it was a good starting point for your discussion. So now, this might sound like a very negative take on the whole business. It's not. I think composite indicators are a great thing, but one should understand why we need them. And personally, as I said, if we are in the business of having them as an input, they really are the first of the input, and they're not the last of the input. So for me, these indicators, they're asking questions, they're not giving answers. So, and this, people who build them, they tend to think they're giving answers, I would say, some of them at least. But and then they're kind of a bit upset that nobody is taking that as an answer because nobody's happy with it. But in fact, it's because the real value added is they're letting people look at them and ask more questions. And the better the indicator, the more questions you ask, the more you want to see bits and pieces and so on. A third thing which happens with all these indicators, especially in our business, which I think is the business of most people here, which is a multilateral environment, is that you want to basically to compare indicators across something. So you don't have one indicator. You have the same indicator calculated for many entities, countries rather than companies or regions, but it's mostly countries. And so how do you compare them? And this is where we had a great experience with the JRC because they help us they devise an algorithm that compares countries that have composite indicators with many different elements. And some countries, for example, have lots of red and lots of green, and some countries have lots of yellow. How do you compare them? So they came up with an acceptable analytical way of comparing these things. And so this, I think, is one place where science, if you want, has some value added. It gives you some rational way of comparing things. Now, let me emphasize that all these indicators and technology, there might be evidence-based, but they're not values-free. So let's not kid ourselves. There is always a choice somewhere, which might be the weighting scheme, for example. So everybody's obsessed with weighting scheme. Is it equal weighting? Do we want to have time-varying weights? We derive weights from how the indicator matches evidence, but then how do we project it into the future? So there is no good answer to this. But it is good that we have many different ways of doing these things as long as we know where they come from. So in this sense, in what we're doing, there is a value in trying to figure rankings as long as it's done transparently, and there is value in discussing weighting schemes, even if this brings us back to looking at the individual components. So one thing economists love to do is to take whatever composite indicator there is, correlate it with some output variable, can be growth. So for example, growth might depend on your innovation index. You find your correlation, you do your causality study so that you transform your correlation into some sort of causation. But then you ask immediately, okay, so this innovation indicator you have has many, many components. Which one is really driving your result? And then again, you decompose because you wonder the important thing, it should have a higher weight than the less important thing. So you might derive weights based on these things. So this is all fine. This is what we do, what we try to do. all the time. At the ECB, we developed a composite indicator for systemic risk, which is supposed to have some early warning properties. In fact, it's more of a coincident indicator, I would say, but anyway, which has equal weightings of financial variables, but there's discussions on working on the weights. One last issue I would like to hit upon, which is tied to this issue of ranking and comparing, it's basically how these indicators stir up very strong feelings in people. Now, it's very surprising for someone who has a scientific background. You say, I'm doing this, it's evidence-based, I'm transparent about my weighting scheme, I'm not going to upset anybody, so I do equal weighting of everything, I have my indicator, and then some people are going to hate it. And they're going to say, this absolutely does not represent what is going on in my world, in my country, in my company, and so on, while others will say, well, I didn't need your indicator to know that Israel is a very innovative country. So just yesterday I was in a meeting where a high-ranking ECB official said, I really did not need your early warning indicator to know that Italian banks are in bad shape right now. So again, you wonder, why am I doing all this if people already know the answer, so they don't need my indicator, or they think it's completely wrong anyway because I will never capture the specificities of their specific situation. And so, again, it is nice to see that people who do this have a sort of positivist faith in their endeavor, and we do actually need this work. But again, we should not really ask what from this work what we cannot get from it. We cannot get answers, we cannot get decisions based on this. We will still have to use our judgment. All we can ask of is to have summary representation of information which is relevant. We know some information is left out, so someone else will bring it into the discussion, but it's always an excellent starting point. I would also argue it's difficult to use these measures. So some people think that you can kind of push discussions out of the room by using science when it's about allocating resources. So the typical situation is you have a pool of something, of money, and you have to divide it up among constituents, and you think, why don't we devise a rule for that, no? And of course, the moment you devise a rule, everybody's happy with a rule that gives them what they want and unhappy with a rule that gives others what you would have wanted. And so it's basically, again, it's a bad idea to ask these indicators for rules to allocate resources. What they should be doing is actually more on the positive side than on the normative side of things. And for that, I think they're great tools. But trying to eschew our responsibilities as decision makers by relying on scientists is just pushing things one step further and delegating to them the choice of the values which are going to inform decisions. So, you might think that scientists are persons too. They also have their own values and judgments. You're just delegated to someone else what is your job or what is our job. And so in this sense, what we should ask of these indicators is, I think, aggregation of information, and we can discuss what information goes in. We can aggregate in different ways, see how robust this is. So I think robustness studies are very important, and that will help us decide, but it will not decide for us. So in this sense, I think that this Competence Centre is very important because it can bring to a wide variety of fields that uses indicators best practices. It can bring transparency. It can ensure that indicators are devised in a way where everybody has all the single components. It is clear what the weighting pattern is, where it comes from. And one last technical issue I would like to raise. So there's a famous economist, Charles Goodhart, who said whenever you choose a variable as your target variable, it loses its meaningfulness because people will play around with that variable. So in fact, when you do an indicator, what you should be doing is backfilling it for as much as you can, because where it's valuable, I would argue paradoxically, it's in the past. It has no value for the future because people will game it. But where it has value is when it didn't exist. So what you should be doing anytime you have an indicator is fill backwards 20 to 30 years and forget about the future.